If her music wasn't enough to make her an icon, which by all measures it is, we would love her anyway. There is some particular shine about this star that seems to be striking a chord with folks even more than usual in this unique moment. During this season of uncertainty and upheaval, she has emerged as a unifying figure, a voice of hope, resilience, and joy. I am, of course, talking about Dolly Parton. And if you don't know, now you know. A philanthropist to the nth degree, she has long been committed to providing scholarships for any kid from her hometown who wants to go to college. She has donated over 130 million books to children around the world. And just recently, you may have heard, she made a mini zeros contribution to the Vanderbilt Medical Center, funding research that made significant strides towards a coronavirus vaccine. It's no wonder the state of Tennessee wants to put a statue of her on the front lawn, literally. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all, the thing that makes Dolly the incomparable force that she is that she doesn't want the statue. She said, "Given all that is going on in the world, I think putting me on a pedestal is inappropriate at this time." And on the face of it, maybe that seems like standard issue humility, an important spiritual gift to be sure. But what it takes to step out of the spotlight in such a moment, it's about more than humility. It's about an internal economy that defies individualism. Knowing that you don't really live for just yourself and that nothing you have is really your own. Because when you get right down to it, you are just part of the neighborhood. It seems like more than anything else, Dolly just gets this fundamental truth in a way that escapes, well, most of us. As a rule, America operates on an economy of self, glorifying independence and rendering individualism a uniquely American idol. Such an economy is rooted in ego, values wealth, seeks status and power over communal well-being, and elevates personal freedom above all else. This, of course, is not news. We have seen the devastation wrought when corporations are relieved of all responsibility for their role in environmental health. The growing impact of climate change mirrors directly the growth of consumer culture. We have witnessed how one of the most privileged countries in the world can still have one of the highest death rates in a global pandemic because some cite personal freedom as a reason to not mask up for their neighbors. And we watch divides grow so much deeper as many white people struggle to answer the call of Black Lives Matter, calling back instead with a tone-deaf response that all lives matter. In an economy of independence, the ability to hear and feel the lived experience of one outside of our own eludes us. We are not generally known as people good at denying the self. So when Jesus calls out, "Deny yourselves, lose your life for my sake," that might just make us squirm. Denying the self is not really our spiritual gift, if you will. Jesus' call to the life of discipleship is not literally about dying, if only it were. In our reality, that might actually be easier than what he's asking. To deny oneself is not about depriving yourself of something like giving up chocolate for Lent. Jesus is asking his followers to deny self with a capital S, like the very idea of it. It's not a form of self-hatred, but the true death of ego. A spiritual discipline to throw aside notions of bootstraps and rugged individualism and to transform our whole internal economy. It is a call on our whole lives to move away from an economy of independence to an economy of interdependence. I guess the good news is that means you can enjoy your chocolate during Lent this year. The bad news is that the real work is harder, because it's not about what we give up. It's about how we show up. When we follow in the way of Christ, we hear the call of Jesus over and above the economy of self. We show up in an altered posture. We belong to the neighborhood, so we invest in a different economy. As the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Week of Compassion witnesses this gospel truth as it plays out again and again, that after a disaster, the most resilient communities are those that were already living in an interdependent economy. Places where people and organizations were already working together to deal with complex issues like affordable housing, food insecurity, education gaps, and systemic racism. And congregations that have the biggest impact in times of crisis are ones that were already invested in the neighborhood. In Nashville, our friends at New Covenant Christian Church were already addressing the pre-existing condition of racism when a tornado devastated their neighbors. They mobilized quickly to respond to the storm, but then almost immediately the COVID-19 outbreak meant that they had to change their whole approach. In Oregon, the folks at Portland First Christian were working hard to serve their unhoused neighbors, even in the midst of the challenges of the pandemic, when historic wildfires complicated needs even further. In Central America, our partners have spent years investing in relationships through sustainable agriculture, and back-to-back hurricanes recently devastated communities that were beginning to flourish through new farming practices. Homes lost, water systems destroyed, a whole year's worth of crops just gone in an instant. And these are just a few of the places where factors of existing poverty layered on top of a pandemic, layered on top of multiple natural disasters, create seemingly impossible challenges. Far too many of our friends have become acquainted with the term compound disasters in the past year. But in every one of these places, strong community ties and an established economy of interdependence meant that we were able to respond quickly and provide immediate relief. And those disciples in Nashville kept working to serve in the aftermath of the tornado and then in the midst of a pandemic, not just meeting immediate needs like food and toiletries, but addressing unjust housing policies that put many of their neighbors at even greater risk. They were already so connected in that place that they knew what the real long-term challenges were going to be. And in a crisis moment, they were ready to go to work. In Oregon, First Christian provided their unhoused neighbors a place to rest and recharge devices, even as other shelters shut down, even as the church itself was closed for business. Their relationships meant they could collaborate and leverage resources. They found a way to provide food and water, even when the fires meant Portland had the worst air quality in the world for a while. In Central America, our partners responded immediately after the hurricanes, providing shelter and food and COVID mitigation supplies because they were already there in the neighborhood. And now they are planning ahead for long-term rebuilding and recovery. And this is happening all over, church. The most life-giving work, the most transformation potential happens where congregations and communities have already learned this gospel truth. Our lives are not our own. We belong to each other. And when you give to Week of Compassion, you become part of the neighborhood. Maybe one of the biggest lessons of this pandemic season, when all is said and done, will be a new understanding of that connectedness. Maybe we'll have learned that economically and otherwise, and whether we like it or not, we are all deeply connected. Our lives are intertwined. Our well-being is bound to that of our neighbors close to home and around the world. And Jesus knew there would be things in this life that we needed to lay down in order to really live, like our attachment to material wealth and the death-dealing systems that diminish the value of some while elevating others. When we learn to lay those things down, what are our hands free for? Our ACT Alliance partners are engaged in gender justice studies, working through what they call transformative masculinities to change harmful norms in many parts of the world. In addition to particular programs and initiatives that provide opportunity and work to end violence against women, it's also a philosophy behind their entire body of work. They are intentional about addressing the kind of toxic masculinity that leads to gender-based violence, and really that often makes life unsafe for those who are not conforming to particular gender roles or norms or identity. The economy of interdependence means that when women thrive, the whole family thrives. When women and children are empowered through education, the whole communities are empowered. When all are treated with dignity, that is good news for the whole neighborhood. And closer to home, the same is true, and we know it, where communities are working to dig out the roots of racism, to protect the environment, to care for vulnerable neighbors. That is always good news for the whole body. Losing your life to find it is not about any single sacrificial act. It's not leaping into the fire or the flood to save someone in a moment of crisis. Losing your life is a daily discipline of setting self aside and living to be part of the neighborhood. Letting the awareness that we are part of a greater whole shape our everyday living and transform our very being. We might also call that being the body of Christ. Our sinful notions of individualism and the ideas that the privileged norms as we know them were somehow ordained by God at creation, Jesus says, lay all that down. Lose your life and you will find it. Over the past year, we have lost life as we knew it. Maybe we've lost loved ones. Even if we haven't, we have lost our rhythms of work, school, worship, social life, a certain degree of mobility, just being able to come and go as we please. But what if that's not really a loss of freedom, but instead an open door, an invitation to lose one way of life and find another? What if we leverage this moment to transform our whole economy from one of independence to interdependence? In the end, Jesus models this new economy with his very life. dying because his way threatened the economy of self and empire. But in his death, as in his life, he gave us the power to transform that economy because he left us to each other. And when we live as the one body of Christ, well, it's not what we give up that matters, it's how we show up. It becomes a very natural thing to sacrifice self for other because others live for us now too. How do we possibly begin, though? With the weight of the world, how do we begin this work of transforming our internal economy to one of interdependence? Maybe to start, we just have to say no to the statue. Show up for the neighborhood. Sing a song. Read a book to a child. Give something away. See what comes to life in front of you. It gets easier from there.